before we get started. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm admitting everybody. So first off, thank you so much for our sponsors and our partners. We have quite a few: Carrollton Springs, the Hogg Foundation, State Fair of Texas, Child's Defense Fund Texas, Blank Slate Therapy, and the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. We're always open to having more partners and anyone who is willing to sponsor. You don't have to be a nonprofit organization, a mental health organization. If you know that your business or maybe your organization is wanting to support this, then please contact me and we'd love to have you on the team. There's so much work to do and we definitely can't do it by ourselves. So we really appreciate everyone being here today. Okay, really short, I want to put this in here because yesterday was International Women's Day. This month is Women's History Month. And I just wanted to put a spotlight on one of our programs because it's not, women's and maternal health is not spoken as much as it should be. And we do provide a free program called Mothers and Babies, which is a 6-week support group. It used to be a home visiting program, but because of COVID-19, we are doing it virtually. This program is free. It is for any mother who is 6 months into their pregnancy or after pregnancy. So even if you're a new mother, a seasoned mother, and you're just had your newborn, or maybe you have a baby who is a few months old, please let us know. Email Maddie Worley. It's a very difficult time in mothers' lives when there's a lot of stressors. Becoming a new mother is just very, it's stressful. I mean, there's not a rule book to it and it's different for everybody. And we want to look at the mental health wellness of mothers. This is a huge vital time in their wellness. And postpartum depression often develops at the late into their pregnancy or even up to years after they have given birth. So we want to prevent that and intervene if there is any development of postpartum depression and to reduce those stressors, especially in a time where a lot of mothers are isolated. So please use that resource. Like I said, it is free. Email Maddie Worley and she can give you all the information for that. And just a reminder, if you've joined us this morning, please introduce yourself in the chat. We really appreciate it. We'd like to hear where you're coming from and what organization you're representing. Just want to ensure that we know everyone who's on the call today. Thank you. Okay, as always, I like to go over our commitment here at MHA Greater Dallas and also for our group. First off is education. Before we can do anything in our community, we have to educate ourselves on the issues, how they impact individuals, families, and communities, on the mental health impact and how racism affects that, how discrimination affects that, before we start making decisions that may impact hundreds, thousands, millions of people. So secondly, we have our Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, which looks to eliminate discrimination and racism in our structural institutions. We get together once a month. We just had our February meeting, which was in March because of the snowstorm, but we're just getting right along, just organizing everything. So I really appreciate everyone who's in on that. And finally, our next commitment is to take action through our task force by taking this education to our task force, and our task force will then come up with recommendations that we can advocate to our community. The power is in policy and how we create our communities and how we create internally with our organizations as leaders within our families. And the only way we can make change is if we take action. So that is a huge component of this series. So please keep that in mind. Just a little bit of our Diversity Inclusion Task Force. Our next meeting is March 18th. If you are interested in dedicating some time to that, typically for a normal member, it's about 2 to 3 hours of your time a month. And then for a leadership position, it's around 4 hours a month. So please, or feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. so I don't forget. And join us. It's an invitation only, so please email me if you are interested. All right, so I'd like to introduce the beautiful Monika Robinson. She's here to go over healing from racism. Some of the things that we're going to be going over today is the historical racism in Dallas and its effects on its communities, on individuals and families, and how that how we will explore internalized racism and historical trauma. So internalized racism on how we look at it, how racism and implicit bias grows within us through the environment that we live in, and how that can impact generations through time. So, and then also we will look to build tools to heal trauma and to eliminate internalized racism. So I'm really happy to have Ms. Monika here. She's a great colleague. We've worked together for, since 2020, which seems forever ago. But yes, thank you, Monika. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give me 1 second to do that so that you'll be able to see my presentation. All right. So like Megan said, thank you for the introduction. I'm Monika Robinson. And today I'm going to lead you guys in a discussion about healing from racism. And as everybody probably is well aware of, we have a lot of healing to do collectively as an entire country, because we have never fully healed from our painful history. And the damage has never fully been repaired. And to me, that's very obvious because of the situation that we're in now and everything that transpired this summer. We know that we haven't fully healed. And we also have a duty to heal ourselves individually. All of us have experienced some level of trauma. And living in the United States, we have experiences surrounding race and racism that we need to heal from, whether it be our historical trauma or our biases, contemporary racism. We all have a duty to heal from that so that we can move on and move forward as a stronger person and as a stronger country. So a little bit about myself. I'm a former teacher. I was an elementary school teacher for about 10 years. I've been an instructional coach where I trained and coached teachers and did a lot of professional development. And right now I'm an education consultant. And I absolutely love talking about racial equity, racism, implicit bias. And I'm passionate also about school discipline and the over-disciplining of Black and Brown students. I have a master's degree in education administration from Lamar University, and my pronouns are he, her, and hers. So these are our objectives that Megan already went over, so I won't go over those again. I like to start off with a land acknowledgement. I think it's important to acknowledge that the land that we're sitting on in North Texas is stolen land. It's land that was home to many indigenous tribes who stewarded this land for thousands and thousands of years before we ever, came here, and before it was essentially stolen from them and colonized. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge, that painful history and the sacrifices that were made by indigenous people. So we're going to dive into a discussion about Dallas's history of racism. And Megan mentioned to me that this is a popular topic and that a lot of people don't know some of the history behind the things that happened in Dallas. We hear about things that happened in the past before this, around the civil rights time and before that, throughout history with things that happen in the deep South, like in Alabama and Mississippi, and the burning crosses and, you know, the lynchings. But Dallas is never really part of that conversation because Texas is seen as a friendly state. Dallas, you know, there was no racism in Dallas. I mean, these are things that people really think because it's not well documented. So there's a quote here from James Baldwin. He's my absolute favorite. History is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. So don't ever let anybody tell you that the history doesn't matter, that we just need to forget about racism and move on, because that's not the case. We're not forgetting about it. We're going to talk about it and celebrate it and learn from it. So I want to start off with the definition of trauma, because the two events, I'm going to talk about two racial terror events that happened in Dallas that a lot of people don't know about, but I want you to think about them in terms of trauma as we talk through them. So this definition came from Mental Health America of Greater Dallas. It's an unbearable trauma, is an unbearable and intolerable event experienced or witnessed. And I want to be clear that it doesn't have to be just one event. Trauma can be many events over a period of time. And later we'll learn how trauma is can actually be passed down through your DNA. Trauma leaves an imprint of that experience on the mind, brain, and body, and underscore body, because trauma happens in the body also. That's a big part of it. It's not just emotional. It results in a reorganization of the way the mind and brain manage perceptions, and it changes one's capacity to think, cope, or trust, underscore trust. So as we're thinking about these racial terror events that happened in Dallas, think about them through a lens of trauma and who was traumatized by this and how that thinking can be perpetuated and institutionalized. So here's the first thing that I want to talk about. This is the lynching of Alan Brooks. So Alan Brooks was lynched on March 3rd, 1910. Okay. He was a 65-year-old African-American man, and he was accused of attempted sexual assault of a 2 or 3-year-old girl. There's varying accounts of how the little girl was, but she was a young child. He worked for her parents, and she had gone missing for a period of time. And during this period of time, they were looking for her, and eventually they found her in the company of Alan Brooks. I don't know what evidence they had that he hurt her or sexually assaulted her. They probably didn't need any. They immediately arrested him, took him to the courthouse, and a mob found out about this. A mob broke into the courthouse. They got him. They tied a rope around his neck. They threw him out of a second-story window onto the ground. They beat him and they dragged him through the streets of downtown Dallas near Main and Eckerd. Okay. The mob grew bigger and bigger. It turned out to be a mob of 5,000 people. Eventually, he was hung at the intersection of Main and Eckerd. There used to be an arch there. It was called the Elks Arch. And you can see in the background him hanging from the arch, and in the foreground you see children. So children witnessed this event and were there. And this photograph was actually later turned into a postcard and was circulated around. So I want you to think, I know that's heavy, that's a lot, but remember, history is this, it's our present. We need to understand these events that happen, and we need to understand that Dallas wasn't innocent in any of this, that things like this happened in Dallas. It was just hidden for a while. I want you to think about this really quickly. I want you to think about what gets passed down from people who witnessed this. And I also want you to think about how is that thinking institutionalized today? And feel free to use the chat. And I think I have a little bit of time where I can read out some of your responses and kind of talk through these two questions. So think about what gets passed down. And I'm thinking one of the things that gets passed down is anti-Blackness, the thought that Black people are criminal. Fear and hatred. Yes, thank you. Definitely Black equals bad. Yes. And I think that fear is a big part of racism. Black men seen as threats, absolutely. Over policing Black people. He was killed without even knowing that he was actually guilty of anything. He wasn't giving due process of the law. Yes, taking the law into your own hands. He was regarded as inferior. And of course, guys, trauma gets passed down. Those children that witnessed that were traumatized. And how do you think they would act out later in life? They may act out as a trauma response. They may begin acting out in violent or aggressive ways because of what they witnessed. And so that thinking is institutionalized in the over-policing of Black people and not giving them due process of the law, interacting with Black people as inferiors and seeing them as criminal. All of that is institutionalized. Okay, so let's look at another event. Now, like I said earlier, people like to think about racial terror in terms of things that happen in the Deep South, like in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and some of those other places. And Dallas is never part of the conversation. But there were bombings in Dallas. Black citizens' homes were bombed. In the 1940s, there was a rash of bombings. And then in the early 1950s, there was a rash of bombings where Black people's homes were bombed, okay? And the Dallas was also an epicenter of Klan violence during the early part of the 20th century. So there were, excuse me, there were bombings. There were people lynched. The lynching of Allen Brooks wasn't the only lynching that happened in Dallas. There were several other lynchings around that time period. So that's important to think about. And a lot of these bombings happened because Black citizens were moving in closer to white neighborhoods. And so people didn't like that. So here's a couple of newspaper clippings that show some headlines from that time period from 1951. There were a rash of bombings in South Dallas. Now this picture here is a present day picture of the site of one of the bombings. And as you can see, it's an empty lot. I don't know if the house was ever rebuilt or if the lot has been empty since the 50s, but there's no house there now. That's just one of the sites of the bombings. There was a rash of them that happened around that time, and a grand jury was appointed to investigate these bombings. And the investigation was important, not because they were trying to solve these crimes and trying to protect citizens. It was important because the bombings, the powers that be believed that the bombings made Dallas look bad and that it harmed the burgeoning business city they hoped to create. And all of this information, I want to share a little tidbit with you. All of this came from a book called The Accommodation. A lot of people haven't heard of it because it's out of print. It was very controversial. It's written by a popular journalist who used to write for the Dallas Morning News, I believe. He writes for the Observer to this day. But he wrote the book all about this racism in Dallas and all of these things that transpired. So that's how I learned about the bombing. And when you receive the participant slide deck, you'll have a PDF of the book. So you can read the book for yourself. And this is a book that's out of print. Dallas, the powers that be in Dallas did not want this book circulating. But I have a PDF of it for you, so you can be able to research some of these things for yourself. Okay, so the next part of the kind of history lesson that we're having here is about West Dallas. So you may know West Dallas because of the Margaret Hill Hunt Bridge that was built in June of 2011. It's that big, beautiful white bridge that you may or may not have driven over. When it was first built, people called it the Bridge to Nowhere because it took you to West Dallas. And to a lot of people, West Dallas was nowhere. Okay, and a side note, Margaret Hunt, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's not Margaret Hill Hunt, it's Margaret Hunt Hill. She's a white philanthropist, and that's who they named it for. So I'm gonna give you a brief kind of history of West Dallas because I think it's an important lesson on how racist policies and practices have created poverty and trauma in that section of Dallas. So West Dallas, it had around the beginning of probably around 1910, the early 1900s, there was 2 cement plants there. And around those cement plants were communities of Mexican American workers, and they called it Cement City. Black workers were there too. And it was an unincorporated part of Dallas. It did not have running water or a sewage system. They had makeshift homes, like shacks that were built around there. And then during the 1940s and 50s, it really got bad. It was a slum. Diseases ran rampant. And just to give you some statistics, is that West Dallas contained, at around this time, the late 1940s, it contained less than 20% of Dallas's population. But it accounted for 50% of the typhus, 60% of the tuberculosis, and 30% of the polio in Dallas County. And infant death rates were unmeasured, but they were thought to be staggering. Okay, so imagine this. And then water's being sold from barrels. There was no sewage system. So the reason that it even existed is because of racism. There wasn't enough affordable housing in Dallas. So people had to live, Black and brown people had to live wherever they could. And so they ended up living in West Dallas, this unincorporated part of the city where no resources were being poured into it. Nothing was being built. The city just, didn't care about that area of town at that time. But around the 50s and 60s, it started arousing the consciousness of, white people. And eventually there was a housing project that was built there around the 1950s, and it stayed there for about 30 years. And it was in disrepair. I'm from Dallas, and I remember that housing project. I was young, I didn't live over there, but I just remember hearing about how bad it was over there. But eventually it was torn down in the 1980s. So I want to talk a little bit about the environmental racism that's happening today, and that's happened, in recent years in West Dallas. So in addition to the cement plants that were in West Dallas, there was also a lead smelter there. And it was located right near Singleton, about a mile or so from 30. Next to this middle school, Thomas Edison Junior High. It's one that DISD closed last year, but that's where the lead smelter was. The lead smelter was there for years. It was finally closed in 1984, but it left behind harmful toxic waste in the air and in the ground. And people don't know that West Dallas was the site of one of the largest EPA Superfund sites in the country. A Superfund, the EPA Superfund program, is responsible for cleaning up some of the nation's most contaminated land, and they respond to environmental emergencies. It basically pours in a lot of money, time, resources, people into cleaning up these areas. So West Dallas was one of those areas that they had to clean up because that much toxic waste existed. And the site was officially cleaned up in 2004. So it took that long to finally get it cleaned up. So you may be thinking like, you know, what happened? What were the effects on the residents that lived there? So this is a quote from Jim Schoenbeck. He's an environmental activist in the Dallas area. He's still relevant and still around today. I saw him recently on a documentary, but he spoke about this on a really great podcast that I've also linked here and that you'll get when you get the participant slide deck. But it's called Cementrification, the Miseducation of Dallas County. He spoke about the environmental effects of those toxic waste on the residents of West Dallas. So we've got poverty, we've got racist policies and practices, we've got an unincorporated part of the city, kind of like a forgotten part of the city. And on top of all of that, we have them being poisoned essentially by these toxic chemicals from the lead smelter and from the industries that are there. And there's still a lot of industry in West Dallas. I work in West Dallas, I'm over there every day. There's still a lot of industry over there. But I'll read this quote from him. He said, it affects your behavior. He's talking about the toxic waste. It affects your behavior much less than your immune system. Blood diseases, cancers of all kinds. There's the blatant stuff that's gotten worse, but it's also this insidious list of symptoms that makes you feel less of your full self. It devolves you as a person, and that to me is really diabolical. The effects at that level, because they are so nuanced that you would never think to blame someone's suicide or depression on air pollution. But that's exactly what's going on if you look at the statistics. So essentially people were poisoned, and this poisoning has led to mental health issues that you can still see those effects today. I want to point out too that something that Jim Schoenbeck pointed out is that if you look at a redlining map, y'all know what redlining is. If you looked at a redlining map and you overlay it on the current industrial maps, you will see that Black and brown people are forced to live near heavy industries. And that's a fact. In Dallas, you'll see a lot of heavy industries near Black and brown neighborhoods. West Dallas is a great example of that. South Dallas is a great example of that. You do not see heavy industry near predominantly white neighborhoods in Dallas. So you have to think about that as environmental racism and the trauma that creates. It creates mental health issues. So that's just another form of trauma. So according to a research study by the Pew Research Center in 2015, it ranked Dallas as one of the most segregated large cities in America, even more segregated than Chicago and Los Angeles. And this is segregation along racial lines and along economic lines. So we're talking about race and class segregation in Dallas. And I've lived here all my life and it's very evident to me. I see it all the time. And it's important to note that racism hurts all of us, not just people of color, but also white people. It hurts everybody because it perpetuates poverty. It deprives people the opportunity to build meaningful relationships with other, people that aren't like them. And when it perpetuates poverty, it costs the city more with programs and welfare and other things to try to eliminate the poverty. Racism is causing more of the poverty. It reinforces fear, and it results in lost labor because of racist policies. And it further causes racial trauma. It's also one of the reasons, Dallas has a big north-south divide. North Dallas looks a lot different from South Dallas, right? And so that's because of segregation and racism. And that's a problem. And we think it's just normal and we don't think about it, but it's not normal. And it's not good for the city. Okay, so we're going to keep going and we're going to stop for questions in probably about 5 more slides. So if you have any questions, if you have any specific questions, you can put them in the chat and Megan will be taking note of those, and we'll stop in just I'll pause, take a sip of water, and I'll let, you know, one or two people ask any questions that you have. So let's talk a little bit more about racism. We talked about kind of the racism that's happened in Dallas, because I wanted to kind of give you an overview, kind of like a quick history lesson, because we have to know where we've been in order to know where we're going, in order to heal. So racism and trauma. So race is a social construct with a lived reality. Race is not biological. It's made up. It's a social construct. Okay, and because the inside of our bodies, it looks the same across all races. We all have the same biological makeup. Inside of our bodies looks the same. So I just want you to be clear that race is made up, and it's a social construct. Racism has caused trauma, and trauma has perpetuated more racism, right? Think back to those boys that witnessed the lynching and were traumatized. They probably grew up to create more racism. So racism causes trauma, and trauma causes racism. And the trauma can come from many directions. You know, right now we're not dealing with lynchings per se, you know, but, you know, it could be argued. I mean, we've seen a lot of police brutality, but it comes from feelings of inferiority that people of color experience. And then those feelings of superiority that the dominant group experiences. All of that can be traumatizing and cause people to have certain responses. So I'm going to talk about internalized racism. There's two types. So there's internalized white superiority. And there's internalized racial oppression. Now, this information comes from the Center for Racial Justice and Education. I'm going to talk about both of those, but first I want to give you a definition of racism. So this isn't the Merriam-Webster definition of racism. As you guys may or may not know, that definition that is in the Merriam-Webster dictionary has been called into question, and they themselves have said that they are going to edit the definition. They're looking at it, and they're going to create, you know, a new one based on more information and things that are happening now, because a good definition of racism focuses on power, and their definition didn't say anything about systems or power. Okay, I know there's probably a lot of definitions out there. This one comes from the Center for Racial Justice and Education. Racism, a system of social structures that provides or denies access, safety, resources, and power based on race categories, and produces and reproduces race-based inequities. I like this definition because it focuses on power and it focuses on a system. And that's what we're talking about. So internalized white superiority is consciously or unconsciously believing that aspects of whiteness are superior and or the norm. So I'm going to show you a few examples of internalized white superiority. Individualism. Individualism is, I've earned everything I've accomplished. I expect to be treated as an individual and not a representative of white people. It's meritocracy. I think most people know now that the American dream is a myth. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps doesn't work for Black and brown people. So the problem with individualism is that it leaves out privilege. And it leaves out the idea that the lack of privilege being a reason that people of color don't have these same outcomes. The second one is denial, not seeing race, questioning the lived experiences of people of color, and not seeing color. And I can't tell you how many times I have had conversations with people that deny racism and deny people of color's experiences. The third one is normative. My experience is the norm. I am normal. Everything else is diverse. That's a hallmark of internalized white superiority, thinking that whiteness is the norm and that everybody else is different or other. Dominating space is taking up physical space, entitlement to speak, dominating meetings, shaping agendas, and gentrification. Something interesting about dominating space that I've noticed is that if you, and you can observe this too, next time you're in a grocery store or you're in a public place, walking down a sidewalk, etc. If you're a person of color, sometimes people of color sometimes yield to white people. They yield to them on the sidewalks, they yield to them in the grocery store, and they're not consciously doing this. I'm not saying people wake up and say, oh, I'm gonna yield to white people today. But I'm saying that it's a learned behavior, and I've seen it happen so many times. And on the flip side, I do see some white people, maybe unconsciously or consciously, dominating space, expecting people of color to yield to them, not yielding on the sidewalk, things like that. So that's something that I've definitely seen, and you can observe in your own everyday life. The last one is intellectualization, valuing experts over experiences and worshiping data. All right, so let's talk about internalized racial oppression. It's thinking and or acting as if aspects of one's own racial group are inferior, deficient, not enough, not deserving, or other. Let's look at how this plays out for people of color. So one example of internalized racial oppression is the model minority myth. And that is referencing Asian Americans. Asian Americans are looked at as the model minority. They're unproblematic. They are perceived as being submissive, and they have the stereotype of being smart and overachieving. And think about if you're an Asian person, what that does to you, because you have this bar set really high. And if you don't achieve that status as the model minority, then, you know, what happens? What does that do to you emotionally and internally? And then Asians are also looked at as a group that tends to be less vocal about racism, or it tends to not have experiences with racism. But we know that that's not true. And it's been happening more and more recently. The next one is questioning one's own ability, intelligence, beauty, and self-worth. And I myself can attest to this, because when I was younger, I didn't think that being Black was beautiful. I thought of whiteness as the standard of beauty, and that it was better to have white features and to have long hair and thin nose and lighter skin. So I questioned my beauty as a Black woman or as a Black girl because of internalized racial oppression. I had absorbed images and messages that told me that white was more beautiful and that was better. The third one is anti-Blackness and colorism. Colorism happens in a lot of communities of color. It means that having lighter skin is more valuable. Being closer to whiteness is more valuable. And this goes back to like slavery times, where the lighter skinned slaves worked in the house and had more resources and had more privileges, and the darker skinned slaves worked outside where it was hot and where the work was harder. And people of color can have anti-Blackness. There are Black people who hate themselves and don't like other Black people. And that's because of internalized racial oppression. The fourth one is stereotype threat. And if there's people of color on the call, you may identify with this, because it's avoiding certain activities for fear that they play into a negative stereotype about your group. So for instance, Black people are sometimes negatively stereotyped as being aggressive or being loud, especially Black women being loud. And so in order to avoid that stereotype threat, some Black people will, when they're operating in white spaces, will choose to tone it down. Be quiet, there's white people around. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't, play into that stereotype as being that loud, aggressive person. And then the last one is policing norms and expectations for people of color. It kind of is similar to stereotype threat. It's seeing sometimes when people of color see other people from their group behaving in these stereotypical ways or these non-white ways, it can result in embarrassment or being ashamed of them, wanting to distance yourself from the behavior of those people that, you know, are in your same racial group, but they're acting in non-white ways. And so you want to police their norms and police the expectations for what they're supposed to be doing. You know, they shouldn't be acting like that, or, you know, things like that. So I wanted to give you guys just a quick quote from an article that I read. It says that internalized racism often manifests itself in different cultural and ethnic groups being pitted against each other for the scarce resources that racism leaves for people who do not have white privilege. This can create a hierarchy based on closeness to the white norm. And that's what I was talking about with colorism. A hierarchy based on closeness to the white norm. The closer you are looking white, the more resources and privileges you have. At the same time, it cripples all of us in our attempt to create a society that works for all of us. So it's still that notion of inferiority and internalized racial oppression. Okay, so now we'll pause. I'll take a sip of water and we'll take some questions. And Megan, I don't know if you're there, your camera's off, but if we had any questions from the chat that, I don't know if we had any from there we wanted to take, or if we wanted to have people raise their hands.
Yeah, if you want to raise your hand, that's fine. I just ask, you know, like we said at the beginning, equity of space, I just want to make sure we all have enough time to get through. I think one was, you know, asking, you know, and I think this is from your perspective, you know, why do you, and your presentation seems to be explaining, you know, a lot of the ins and outs of it, but, you know, why is there a continued divide, you know, in the present day? Why do we continue to just kind of fall into this sequence? What do you think is going to be something to solve that?
Yeah, I think that the continued segregation that we see in society, and I'm going to speak about Dallas because this is where, you know, we all live, but not being able to sit down and have conversations with people that don't look like us. You know, having that fear of the other, that's what's holding us back. You know, and the north-south divide, like I was saying. And that's why, you know, a park is being built over near the zoo, and that's in an attempt to connect the north and south together. So hopefully that people from the north side will come to the park, and there can be, you know, just more interaction amongst the different races. We just don't have enough of that. And I love discussions like this, where we have Black people, white people, all different kinds of races on a call together, where we're able to have those important and uncomfortable discussions. We get it, it's uncomfortable, so people just don't want to bother with it. But I think if we can come together, and we're going to talk about that in the healing part section of this, we're going to talk about some ways that we can heal from it. But we had to start from the beginning and talk about the history of it first before we can talk anything about healing. There are some. Go ahead. Do you want me to grab some of these questions from the chat?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, I'll grab a couple of these from the chat. Somebody said, Patrick said, if white people are the majority, why is there fear of the Black man, especially an educated Black man? I can't answer that for you. I think it results, it's just from our past history. It's passed down, the anti-Black sentiment that's been in the United States, you know, since the beginning of its history. There's always been an anti-Blackness, and there's also that fear of other, you know, and it just keeps perpetuating. And so we need to stay educated, stay woke. We need to read. We need to talk to each other and not be afraid of each other. There's a lot that has to happen. And I think conversations like this are the beginning of it. Somebody, Jewel asked, is there any redlining or other racist city policies in effect today? No, redlining ended in the 60s. I mean, it ended so long ago, but man, did it do damage. It did damage that we still see today. People think, oh, that was just a policy from a long time ago. They stopped doing that. They were supposed to stop doing that, but I don't think the day the policy passed or the law passed that they all just stopped and decided to play fair. I will say that it's more covert than overt. We don't see a lot of overt racist policies, but we do see policies that aren't equitable and that don't help our Black and brown communities and that keep people in poverty. The whole situation with the Shingle Mountain, that was racism. That was not listening to a Black woman who's saying, you know, this stuff is killing me, like, come, you know, help me try to remove this environmental pollution from my backyard, essentially. And she wasn't heard, and nothing happened until it went public. So just things like that are still happening today. It's more covert, but it's still happening. Okay, so we will move on and continue on because I know some people were asking about healing and that's coming up. So I'm going to keep. And Megan, what time do we have till? Because I didn't look at what time we actually started.
Start around 10:15, but we have till 10:30. So. Okay,
but I need to. 10:15.
Yeah, wrap up. Mm-hmm.
Good, perfect. We're on time. Okay. So I want to talk about how trauma is passed down, because I think that's something important to realize. So there's epigenetics. So according to the CDC, epigenetics is a study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Okay. And stress can cause inheritable gene defects that can be passed down to your children. So trauma is passed down. And epigenetics is somewhat of a new science they're doing a lot of research in, but it's a real thing. Stress chemicals can be passed from a mother to her baby during pregnancy. And trauma is passed down from generation to generation through not only through genetics, but just through culture, through family structures. So that's kind of how racism gets passed down. And that's how these feelings of inferiority and superiority get passed down. And unhealed trauma can present itself in many ways. Like some people don't act out. People have different responses to trauma. Some people don't act out and it's not evident. And then other people can act out in very violent and aggressive ways. So that's important to note. And also it's important to note that trauma is more than just one specific catastrophic event. It can be many events over time. And then of course it can be inherited. So this next slide, this is a lot, but I'm going to try to do it justice. I want to talk about historical trauma because it's important to know that we could a lot of us have trauma in our DNA. We have a history of trauma within our race that's been passed down and within our racial group. And it could be, and that has an effect on how we act today and the things we do today. And these trauma responses are passed down and passed down and passed down, and they can start to look like culture. And I'm going to talk about that, especially for African Americans. So for African Americans, historically, we know that Africans were brought to America for the purposes of slavery. They endured a tremendous amount of stress and trauma. And this experience was one of continual violent attacks on the mind, body, and spirit. I think we all know that. That's not a secret. But one example of trauma being passed down is one that I read in a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGruy. It's an excellent book. She gave an example of this. So she said that one trauma response that happened from times of slavery is that back then a mother would when she was asked about her kids, or not even when she was asked, but she would just talk negatively about her kids because she did not want them to be taken by the master and sold into slavery. So she might say, oh, that boy's not worth anything. He can't even lift a rock, or he can't even walk, or he's not good, or she's this or she's that, because they wanted to avoid having their child be a victim of any type of abuse, rape, or to be sold, or any of the horrors of slavery. So in order to do that, they would downplay the abilities of their children. Flash forward to today. If you're a person of color, if you're a Black person, you may have seen or witnessed this happen, and I know I did in my family. Black mothers will sometimes downplay their children's abilities in the present day. When they're asked about their kids, they may say, oh, that boy just plays video games all day. He didn't even clean up. They won't, even though they're proud of their kids and they love their kids, they sometimes do not talk about them in positive ways. And I've seen that happen over and over. And what I learned from the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is that's a trauma response that's been passed down. And it starts to look like culture, and it starts to look like something that just Black mothers just do. But there's a reason for that, and it stems from times of slavery. For Native Americans, we know that they faced extermination. They were killed. Their children were forced to go to assimilation schools, where essentially they had to unlearn their culture and learn the white culture. And then we had the Trail of Tears, where Native Americans, indigenous people were forcefully removed from their lands. And many of them died of starvation. They died just because the trip was arduous. They were removed from their land. So that creates trauma. For white Americans, not a lot of talk about the trauma that white Americans experienced, but it wasn't necessarily trauma that happened here in America. White Americans descended from Europe, right? We all know that there was no America, right? They came and created America. So a lot of them descended from Europe. And so in the Middle Ages, like around the 14, 15, 1600s, there was the Inquisition. It was where people were routinely, brutally killed in public, but for the crime of heresy, which was speaking against the church. So people were witnessing this daily assault that was happening on people. I mean, these were brutal executions. They weren't just hangings. Also around the Middle Ages, there was the plague, and it was the bubonic plague that killed millions of people. And then when these Europeans who were dealing with the poverty, they were dealing with starvation. I mean, Europe wasn't a great place to live here in like the 1600s. Those people came and created and started a new country here in America. It came for a better way of life. They did not want to live under the king anymore. They wanted, freedom. So once they got here, we had the Salem witch trials. So this brutality continues. The brutality that they were subjected to and that they witnessed, they perpetuated it once they got here. They perpetuated it with slavery, the brutality and the horror of slavery. And then we had the Salem witch trials here in Massachusetts. So people were burned at the stake for the crime of being, speaking against the church or being a witch. And then there was extreme poverty, like I said, during the Middle Ages, the 1600s in Europe. There was poverty, there was starvation. So they experienced trauma on almost the same level, as other groups. I mean, they weren't enslaved, so I'm not going to go that far, but it was trauma. And so for Latinx people, they also experienced wars. There's countless wars in South America, Mexico. There was slavery in South America. There was famine, there was pandemics. So there was trauma. Every racial group has experienced trauma, and that trauma gets passed down. And it affects the way we treat each other, and it affects our perspective. And it often presents itself as just being the culture of a group. So I just want to be clear that a person does not have to experience these situations in order to feel the trauma or to have that trauma response. There's also secondary trauma of watching someone else be traumatized. And that's what happened, you know, in Europe with the Inquisition. You're watching someone being brutally killed. That's trauma. So we're going to get to a discussion about healing. And there's a great quote here from Resmaa Menakem. He's the author of My Grandmother's Hands, an excellent book about healing from trauma. And in the resources on this slide deck that you'll get, I've listed a lot of the books that I've read, and that helped me, you know, synthesize all this information and be able to create this presentation. So I would definitely recommend that book. But he said that healing involves discomfort, but so does refusing to heal. And over time, refusing to heal is always more painful. So healing comes from acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge and know what happened in the past before we can start to heal. Listening to other people's stories and exploring our own trauma. So we'll talk about some ways to heal, like mindfulness, affinity groups, healing circles, and just being aware of your own bias. So here are some ways here that you can heal. I'm going to go through each of these, but I'm going to talk more on some upcoming slides about mindfulness, and I'm going to talk more about having uncomfortable conversations. Couldn't remember which one it was. So the first one is pretty simple. It's view everyone as an equal, and it's easier said than done because people of color have that feeling of inferiority. Even though it might be unconscious, you may not wake up in the morning and say, I'm inferior, but because of the messaging that you've absorbed over your lifetime living here in America, you might have an unconscious feeling of inferiority. And then white people will have that unconscious superiority. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about in the grocery store. When white people don't yield, some white people don't yield to people of color. And then people of color yield the right of way to white people. It's that dynamic. But if you consciously go through life viewing people as an equal, it really helps. I've been trying to do that myself and just thinking nobody is superior than me and nobody's inferior than me. And just having that on the forefront of your consciousness is very helpful. The second one is having uncomfortable conversations, not shying away from talking about race. The days of ignoring race and not talking about it are over. We're going to talk about it because that's how we heal from it. Then the third one is confronting your own bias. Everybody has bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. I want you to really understand that. Don't ever let someone tell you they don't have bias. That everybody has it. It can be unconscious where they don't know they have it. You may think that you treat everybody the same and that you don't see color. Hopefully you're not still saying that you don't see color, because we know that's not true. Everybody sees color. But you may think that you have these views of everybody being equal, but deep down you might have absorbed messages that told you that, you know, white is better. You know, so really be truthful with yourself and confront your own bias. And respect the lived experiences of others. We never want to tell someone that what they've experienced isn't true, that it didn't happen. I've never heard of that. I can't tell you how many times, y'all, that people have told me that racism isn't real, that this didn't happen, it's not happening today, we need to get over it, we've had a Black president. No, that none of that is true. We have to respect the lived experiences of other people. They're telling you they've experienced discrimination, racism, believe them. You know, it's their truth. It might not happen to you because maybe you're a person of privilege and it doesn't happen to you, but it definitely is happening on a daily basis to others. Another thing that I talked about earlier is build cross-cultural relationships. We don't have enough of that. If all you do is socialize with people that look like you, try to seek out some new relationships. Try to talk to other people. that don't look like you, because then that eases the fear that we sometimes have of other people who don't look like us. So socialize beyond your bubble and find commonalities with people. And then the last one is practice mindfulness. That could be yoga, deep breathing, meditation, anything that will help you focus on staying in the present moment is helpful. It's a great quote from The Cycle of Liberation. It's not a book, but it's an article about liberating ourselves from systemic racism. And it's by Bobby Harrow. He says, if all of this sounds overwhelming, remember that you don't have to deal with everything. You don't have to set yourself the impossible task of transforming society. All you can do is what you can manage to do. Secure in the knowledge that you're making it easier for other people now and in the future to see and do what they can do. So rather than defeat yourself before you start, think small, humble, and doable rather than large, heroic, and impossible. And I like that quote because, healing is a journey. You're not trying to do all of these heroic things today. You're going to start with small, manageable things that are comfortable for you to do, and then work your way into it and do more and more as time goes on. So mindfulness, I said I would talk more about mindfulness. And I started my journey with mindfulness with a book called Energy Codes. And I put it in the resources. So when you get this slide deck, you will see it. But it's called Energy Codes, and it's by a doctor. Her name is Sue Morter. Because this summer, with all the racial protests, the pandemic was going on. George Floyd was killed. The world was on fire. So I wanted to try to explore some of the anger and anxiety that I was feeling surrounding all of those events that were happening over the summer and since the pandemic started. I wanted to figure out a way to let out some of that frustration and anger, and to let in love and empathy and compassion and calm and strength. And so I started off reading that book, and it had some very doable things, mindfulness exercises, breathing techniques that you can do to start to heal yourself from some of these stressors that we have in our lives surrounding anything that could be happening. Maybe you're traumatized by something else that's happened in your life, but especially it can help us slow down and process our pain, our confusion, our anger that happens when we begin exploring our own racial identities and when we begin confronting racism in America. It can be painful. These practices can also help us stay in the conversation, because the tendency is to want to shut down, especially when you're first learning, to want to run away from it. But it helps us kind of breathe and kind of stay in the moment, stay in the conversation, and hopefully open us up to begin thinking differently. We can create, this is something big that I actually learned from that book, is that we create stories in our minds. Watch yourself for the rest of the day and watch the stories that we create in our minds. Sometimes we create scenarios and we overthink and we create these stories. And I was doing that a lot. And so mindfulness just helps me stay out of story and helps me stay in the present moment. Another hallmark of mindfulness is just breathing. If you don't learn anything else from mindfulness, you'll learn to breathe. And doing those deep, cleansing, slow breaths, I'm telling you, it does wonders. I was doing them before this presentation. And because just like anybody else, I love talking in front of people, but I still get nerves, and so taking those deep cleansing breaths really does relax and calm your body. So that's, if nothing else, you can start off with breathing. So another thing that can help us heal is building community. So healing can happen collectively, or it can happen individually, or maybe, you want to be on both sides of that. But if you are a person who wants to heal collectively and you are empowered by having conversation and that's how you heal, then dialogue is important. And there's two ways to do it. You can have dialogue and conversation and discussion with people that look like you, and those are called affinity groups. And I've done those before, and it's great to be able to talk with people who identify the same race as you, to be able to discuss and talk about your experiences. And you just have a lot of camaraderie and things in common, and it's great. So dialoguing with people like you can just be an informal conversation with a friend or colleague, or it can be an affinity group. And then the second way is to dialogue with people who are different from you. So that looks like a healing circle or a community event or a workshop where different people from different races are there and you're all dialoguing together. One group that does host healing circles is Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. They had one last week. They hosted a virtual healing circle. They did mindfulness, they did meditation, they had discussion. I wasn't available to go to it that day, but I'm sure it was an amazing event. So that is a group that if you're interested in healing circles, that you should keep an eye on their website, because I'm sure they will have more events coming up in the future. And they're free and they're virtual, so you don't even have to get in your car and drive anywhere. So through dialogue, we can share experiences and we can move beyond the fear and the stereotypes. Something important that came from the article, The Cycle of Liberation, is that he said, we may come to realize, through this dialogue and conversation, that neither the privileged nor the disempowered are responsible for oppression. It's the system that pushed us into these roles. Nobody's born wanting to be a person of, a superior, seen as a superior person. Nobody's born wanting to be seen as inferior. Nobody asked for this when they were born. It's a system that put us into those roles. So when you start to look at it that way, you stop blaming the other group. When you realize that most people living today didn't ask for this system, and most don't like the system, although of course there's exceptions and some people think it's great, but most of us on this call would say we know that this is a broken system. So just realizing that we can't blame, there's no blame to be put on a specific group who didn't ask for this. None of us asked for this. So I think that was really helpful in helping me to be able to get over any type of anger or blame that I wanted to dish out, and just to move past that and move into healing. That's an important point. So some ways to open up dialogue. As I was creating this, Megan kind of gave me a suggestion that, people have trouble opening up the dialogue and the conversation, or they don't know how to start it or what to do. So if you want to start healing and you want to start having conversations with people, you can host or join a healing event. There's healing events that happen all the time, but the National Day of Healing, it's in January. It's around MLK Day. I don't know what specific day it's on, but that's a great day to, have a healing event or start a conversation. There were a lot of healing events that day. I did go to one of them that was with the Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. So again, keep an eye on their website because they'll have some more events coming up. But I did link something there. I think that it's from Race Forward that gives you some more information on healing events. And then there's a conversation guide here that I've linked as well on the second one. That has ways to get a conversation started. It has some talking points and some ways to get people telling their stories. Storytelling is an easy way to get people to open up because people love to talk about themselves. Most people do. And so being able to just have people tell stories or to talk about a specific topic or something that's happened in their lives is a great way to open up conversation. The third way is to start a book club. I mean, you and some friends could read an anti-racist book, and have discussions about it. It's great to have discussions surrounding a book, very easy. And I've listed several books in the resources portion of this presentation that will help you get started. And then also if you're wanting to talk to kids about racism, I have a book list here that has Lots of great books that can help you start talking with children about racism and different people and culture and perspectives, and just to expose them to those things. So the resources are listed here. And again, you'll receive this participant slide deck from Megan, and you'll be able to click on some of the resources here. A lot of them are about the history of racism in Dallas. And then there's mindfulness tips, mindfulness coaching, and things like that as well. And then the book recommendations are here too. I've read and I own all of these books, and they are amazing. So I'm just going to stop here because I think I'm right on time, Megan.
Good job.
We made it through.
We made it. Yes, yes. Thank you so much for being so thorough. I mean, I have been to many presentations, and, you know, like you said, you have to keep going to these things. You have to see things from different perspectives, going to other webinars, and I've been to a lot of them, and yours was exceptional. So thank you so much for supplying us with all this information and all these tools. I do want to invite everybody to put any questions. We'll have around 15 minutes for questions. You can raise your hand, but you know, there are a lot of people on this call today. But if you have any questions or need to bring up something to bring to our attention, please let us know. Monica, you did a wonderful job. I think we're seeing it all in the chat. Everyone,
thank you. I really
hands all around.
Yeah, I love the feedback. Any feedback is
yes,
definitely appreciated, because I'm always trying to get better.
Yes.
So one chat for questions too, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to post a link, everyone. Okay. So that goes to our link tree. You've probably seen it in our past workshops. On there is our certificate of attendance. Since you've attended this workshop, everyone gets a certificate of attendance. Now, this is different from your CEU. If you look at the post-presentation survey that is linked on there, please take that. That is for everybody. Monica wants feedback. I want feedback. We're at the halfway point of our workshops. This is workshop 3. So I'd love to get your feedback on what workshops you've attended and what they worked for you and what didn't work for you. These are made for the community. So please let me know, and I'll continue to look at those, that feedback. And secondly, Monica's slides are on there. So her healing from racism post-presentations or post-presentation slides, please grab that. I can actually link that directly into the chat so everyone has that. I'm not seeing any questions either, but we'll continue.
One up at the top. Yeah, and if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or chat. But
yes.
Katie had a question. She said, are there activities that can help challenge and change racial understandings / biases, such as reading literature from non-white authors, studying the history, mythology, and legends of non-white cultures? I would say all of that. I mean, you can most certainly do all of that to understand different perspectives. People don't like to walk through the world and you should never ask somebody from a different racial group to explain their culture to you. So reading about it and researching it on your own is definitely the way to go. And then also participating in some of those racial healing circles and things like that can help you have a chance to dialogue with people from different races. I know Megan mentioned to me yesterday, and I agreed with her. She said that she wants to learn more about Native American and indigenous culture. And she wants to find, an ally, from that background. And I agree with her. I want to learn more about that too. And of course, we do our own research. We were both kind of talking about some different things, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, typically I always ask at the end of the presentation, what more can we do? But you did so well. I have things to read later.
Somebody said the link to the slides is not working. Is that true for everybody? I'm going to stop sharing because I want to go and check the.
The link works if you download the slides first.
Okay. Thank you, Joni.
Thank you.
And you can always, if you have trouble, you can chat us, or you can always email Megan later if you still can't get into the slides. But
Monica's bio is on that link tree, and it has a link to her website. So if you're wanting to get in touch with Monika, learning more about what she's doing, obviously the great presentations and background that she has. Monika, is there any other way that people can connect with you?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I love giving these types of talks. I can talk about this. I can talk about implicit bias. So yeah, definitely reach out to me on my website. If you're wanting to schedule something for a group or for an organization. I'm on Twitter. I am not a big social media person. I'm just not. I just never have been, but I'm trying out Twitter. So I do have my Twitter there on the first slide of the slide deck. So you can always contact me on Twitter or through my website or through my email. That's all linked there on the first page of the slideshow.
Great. And there's a question about recording. So just to let everyone know, we are putting this on YouTube. I hope to have it up by Friday. It takes me a little bit to edit and put it on there. But hopefully it's on there by Friday. We do have a playlist going with all the previous workshops, our kickoff event. So if you weren't able to attend any of the previous workshops or go to our kickoff event, I can't supply you, obviously, being in attendance or CEU, but please look at those presentations. They have tools just like this one. They have, information about our speakers and all the information that you can get as far as how mental health is impacted by racism and discrimination. We're doing our best to make sure that everyone has access to this. So just a reminder there, it is on YouTube on a playlist.
Somebody asked about, so there's two things from the chat I want to talk about. So one person said they were reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And that is an excellent book. I own that book and I've read it and it's wonderful. And they asked, apart from that, the list I shared, are there any other book recommendations? I would say anything by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I should have linked him, some of his books on there. He is a wonderful, he has a wonderful perspective about race and racism in America. So any books by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and also Joy DeGruy. She's the one who wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and she has some other books that are worth reading as well. So I would look into those authors for sure. So yeah, those would be my recommendations. And then the other thing that is tickling me right now is Calissa, I hope I'm saying your name right, or Calicia Tasby. I saw your name when we first came onto the call, and I was wondering if you might be related to Sam Tasby. And so for those who don't know, Sam Tasby is a person who sued DISD. I was actually going to talk about this in the presentation, but I had to take it out because it was too long. I was over time. So I took this out, but I was going to talk about how DISD did not desegregate schools until like the 70s. And they didn't even do it then. They refused to desegregate DISD. And so Sam Tasby led an effort to sue DISD to get them to desegregate schools. And so Calicia that's her great grandfather. And they have a school in DISD named after him. It's over off of Park Lane and 75 in Dallas. It's a newer school. They named it after Sam Tasby. And I'm actually doing some work. Megan and I will be doing a town hall with community members around Sam Tasby on April 27th.
Yes.
It was great that Calicia chimed in the chat. So yeah, your grandfather was amazing. And it's funny because I did have that in the presentation, but I took that out. But yeah, love it.
So Monika, is it okay? Well, I'll reach out to you. I might have to download the slides and give it out to a couple people for those who aren't getting the link, but we could talk about that offline.
We can talk about it, yeah, and we want to make sure everybody can access it. So yeah, we can work on that. We can download it as a PDF and email, and I can email it to you. I can do that right now while we're wrapping up.
Okay, so I put the link to our YouTube channel on there, so please subscribe. If you subscribe, you get you usually get notifications whenever we upload a new video, whether it's with our playlist for changing the course or anything else. So we'd love to let you watch our videos. There's a couple on quarantine and how that affects mental health, and a bunch of different resources in our community. So please check that out. We have a lot to offer. We usually try and post whenever we can. I will post the link tree one more time in the chat, and feel free to bookmark that. I usually keep it, that's the same one for every workshop, and I usually keep everything up to date whenever we get a new workshop. Next month, I'm gonna try and put a presentation together, not myself, but grab a speaker to speak on LGBTQ plus communities and the intersectionality of race and ethnicity. Pretty broad subject, but hopefully to talk about any traumas, mental health experiences surrounding that issue. So I hope to do that. I do want to make a last announcement. Our Coalition on Mental Illness meeting is next Wednesday for any coalition members. The invitation should be sent out tomorrow, but just want to let you guys know as far as that. Last call for any questions. We're kind of running out to the last few minutes, so I want to make sure if you do have any other questions to please let us know. Before you leave, please do the survey, please. We need that information so that we can keep providing everybody with these great workshops. They do make a difference.
I had one question. I'm going to try to frame it really in a way to understand. But like, how can you open up some of these conversations or name racial trauma from a mental health perspective? And in supporting, for example, if you're working with adults or children of color, that a lot of what the stress they're experiencing might be because of racism, might be because of these racial trauma issues. However, they're not in a space where like they either don't know all of the definitions of these, or they're not in a space where, for example, they can embrace safely their racial ethnic identity because the system around them won't accept them that way because the system hasn't changed quite yet. What is the best way to open up conversations and support those individuals from like a mental health perspective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't know. I think from a perspective of a Black person living in America, I think where to start would maybe be to help them understand about the internalized racial oppression and internalized white superiority. Those two things right there, that really helped me. When I was first learning about those two things, I was like, oh, and so they start to like wake up and realize that this notion of inferiority is made up. It's not real, and they start to realize that this is a system that was created, that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And I think from there, they can start waking up and start having more pride in themselves, self-esteem and pride, and learning about, that our culture their culture isn't inferior, that there's much to be celebrated, so I think starting there from, a self-esteem perspective and starting from the internalized racial oppression and the white superiority, if they start to understand those concepts and how it was created, that can help to open them up to new possibilities and help them realize that they are valuable.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you, Monica. Just as a firsthand experience on this is, I'm a first generation Mexican American. And so there's a lot of history that goes into that. And I think what opened my eyes a little bit was seeing history differently and going to sessions that have different cultures, histories, whether it's Mexican American, Native American histories, Black American history, and just really seeing that the good and the ugly, right? And seeing how that affected families really opened the doors. Because I think a healing process is becoming more mindful and aware of the situation you're in. And really, you can't force someone to do that. It's just guiding them the way to open those doors, for sure. Thank you, Katie, for your question.
Yes.
Any other questions? We are on the tee here. I think that's it. Okay. Well, if everyone knows how to get a hold of Monika, that's great. Please do so. So if you want more, she loves this history aspect of it. She's a great presenter. Obviously, you have already witnessed this. So please contact her. Contact me if you have any questions about our workshops. Thank you, Monika, so much. I'm so grateful for you. And thank you for everybody for attending and giving us your time. We really appreciate you learning more about this issue and being dedicated to it. So everyone have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.